Listen to this. That's Nuggs. He's a dog, and that's the sound of him having a drink after a walk. But Nuggs isn't in a home. He's at the City of Buffalo Animal Shelter, and he's being returned to his cage by Julie, a volunteer.
There's not that many of us. We don't have a lot of funding. We don't even have a lot of time, but we do tremendous things with what we have.
This is Lifted by Rise Collaborative.
I wanted to do something to really help the neediest dogs, the ones that were getting overlooked over and over and over again.
The podcast profiling the people and perspectives of Buffalo and Western New York. Hear more from Julie and Nuggs after this. Casey Kelly is an independent designer and educator who works with brands, clients, studios and agencies through her business, Buffalo Design Studio. From brand development, strategy and planning through design, production and implementation, Casey will work with you to deliver creative, provocative work that connects with the right audiences at the right time. Visit buffalodesignstudio.com or follow Casey on Instagram at Buffalo Design Studio to learn more. The City of Buffalo Animal Shelter is animal control for the City of Buffalo.
And how is it funded?
It's funded through taxpayer dollars. It's actually under the Sanitation and Parks Department, I believe.
And can you tell us a little bit about who is making the crunching sounds in the background?
I have a friend with me. His name is Nuggs. He's about 1 to 2 years old. He's just a random pit bull mix that came in as a stray. And he's my current favorite, who needs a little extra attention, a little extra time out of his cage. So I brought him along for us today.
We're at the Buffalo Barkery in downtown Buffalo. Julie and Nuggs stopped by for a chat on their evening walk. Or for a chew, in Nuggs' case. Julie volunteers with the Friends of the City of Buffalo Animal Shelter. It's a non-profit group that's separate from the shelter. It's not run by the city, but they do work with the city-employed animal control staff.
We are all volunteers, even the board of directors. We're all unpaid positions.
The volunteer group was officially founded in 2005, and they run the cat and dog adoption programs. Julie works with the dogs and also does the sponsorship side of things. So she organises stuff like reduced adoption fees. Julie says the vast majority of dogs come in as strays, just like Nuggs.
He is pretty typical of many of our dogs. He's very young, very athletic, has a lot of energy, really likes to bond with his people. Get on your bed with your bone.
Nuggs is typical of lots of dogs at the shelter in lots of ways. So, for example, it seems he's not trained. And as Julie mentioned, he's a young pit bull type breed, a large breed dog. All of that can make them difficult to rehome.
Why is it so often this breed, pit bulls, that are the ones that usually become the long-term residents?
There's a lot of different reasons. The term pit bull goes for all different dogs. It's a blanket term for many different breeds. But they, for whatever reason right now, are the most irresponsibly overbred dogs. Anyone that lives in Western New York and Buffalo is very aware that our city is going through a great renaissance, but we also have a lot of poverty in our city. We do have a lot of people in our city that are very desperate to make a buck, to support themselves, to support their family. So they will breed their dogs and then sell the puppies for $100, $200 a pop, and for them that's rent. That's keeping them in their house for the month. They're not really thinking of the long-term effects of it.
Julie says that another reason is likely to be a lack of education about the overpopulation issue and the benefits of spaying and neutering.
It's a complex issue, and it's not the dog's fault. It's not the breed's fault. It's sometimes not even the person breeding them's fault. It's a whole cycle of poverty and misunderstanding within the community. And that's when it ends up with us. And we are stuck kind of cleaning up other people's mistakes with training, with lack of training. 90% of our dogs are between 1 and 2 years old. They're young. There's nothing wrong with them other than they have no training. So we... Oh, Nuggies, you ate that whole thing already. I want to get him.
And that's the problem all along this process, the lack of training. It's likely to be why many of these types of dogs ended up in the shelter in the first place. They've become unmanageable when not given the proper attention. but it's also what's holding them back from finding a new home. After all, an untrained large breed dog can be a challenge to prospective adopters. So the shelter staff and volunteers obviously give the dogs some basic training where they can. But some dogs need more attention than that. And this is where the problem deepens. The shelter doesn't have a trained dog behaviour specialist on a day-to-day basis. And that's something Julie says privately run shelters usually have.
We just don't have the realistic resources to do much more than we do.
Of course, the group works hard to try to combat this and get the dogs rehomed quickly. There are things like dog adoption events, clear the shelter drives, and reduced adoption fees. But without that professional training,
it's our long-term dogs that are still sitting there.
The problem won't budge. And let's be real for a minute. The longer a dog is in there, the longer they're in the stressful shelter environment. And Julie tells me what can happen when dogs with behavioural needs aren't rehomed quickly.
So behaviors that come in and are trainable at the beginning of their stay with us, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 8 months down the road, become unmanageable and result in euthanasia oftentimes.
It's a depressing reality of the animal rescue world. It's one that nobody at the shelter wants and that they work hard to avoid. But it is a reality. Julie stresses that the shelter has no set time limit for a dog, as there is in many southern shelters. This option only happens if a dog is deemed unsafe for the community, and only after intervention attempts and consultation. Ultimately, the shelter has a responsibility to the community it serves. They can't put an animal into society that is a danger to people or to themselves.
No dog is ever going to be like the one before it, and each circumstance is different. So when we do make the decisions to euthanize a dog, it is not easy on anyone.
It's an unfortunate bunch of circumstances. An overpopulation of dogs that need specialist training and not enough money to provide it. But that's where Julie comes in. In the summer of 2018, there was a stroke of luck. The Friends of the City of Buffalo Animal Shelter received a message that said,
"We'd like to make a large donation, but how can it best be put to use?"
A board member of the group contacted Julie to say,
"Julie, I know you got a lot of ideas. What can you do with this?" And that's where Trainable started.
Trainable. It's a program that focuses on getting professional training for those dogs that have special behaviour needs. The ones that are the most at risk of being in the shelter for too long because of those needs. Oh, and by the way, Trainable, when spelled out, is 3 words. Train a bull, as in train a pit bull. Trainable. Get it? Huh. Anyway.
The idea is that we don't want to sit here and watch this dog get into the trouble that we foresee him getting into. So let's act now. Let's change this right now.
Julie does this by hiring outside dog behaviour specialists. She consults other volunteers and staff, and then she selects dogs for the programme.
It's trainable for the dogs, but it's also trainable for us volunteers.
Step 1 of the programme is a shelter visit from the dog behaviour specialist, who teaches the volunteers how to train the dog in question.
So every trainable session that we attend, we learn something.
Step 2 of the programme only happens if those new training techniques aren't having the desired effect. So this stage involves the dog being fostered by the behaviour specialist for a short time, and the dog gets trained while there.
So far, we've been very fortunate. All of our trainables have went on to be adopted, to become the dogs that we knew they could be. And that's the goal. That's the goal that we see, that these dogs can live in society. They just need a little bit of help. And we're here to try to do that as fast as we can. It's a beautiful spring day, finally. It was a long, hard winter of walking dogs.
I join Julie and Nuggs on their walk back to the shelter.
So how often do they get walked?
Hopefully once a day, sometimes on days like Saturdays, Monday and Wednesday night we're open later. They'll get out 2-3 times a day, but not as much as they would if they were living in a home. We always say too, when we're walking our dogs, we try to be a role model for the breed. We always want to have our dogs as well behaved as we possibly can. We always want to make sure that we're in control of them and displaying them in the best light possible. because every time we're out with a shelter dog, we're representing all shelter dogs.
Trainable has been active since September 2018, and at the time of recording, 8 dogs had been through the programme.
This is the hardest part for him, is behaving in here.
The shelter and the non-profit group still don't have enough funds for an in-house dog behaviour specialist. But because of the Trainable programme, the neediest dogs get access to them. And that's the start. Nuggs isn't actually a part of the Trainable programme. Julie says he responded well enough to the volunteers and their own attempts at setting boundaries. But he's been at the shelter since January. And a loving home where he gets all the focus and training he deserves is a better place for him than the shelter. But for today, it's back to his cage. Good boy, Nuggs. You've been listening to Lifted by Rise Collaborative. Thank you to Casey Kelly and Buffalo Design Studio for sponsoring this episode. Lifted is a weekly podcast, so hit subscribe or add us to your podcast library so you never miss an episode. And for the latest news on Nuggs, visit our website, risecollaborative.com, and find the post related to this podcast episode. Or simply enter into the search bar Nuggs, Nuggs. Lifted is produced by me, Holly Kirkpatrick, for Rise Collaborative.